It all started on a Tuesday morning, one of those crisp days where the air feels fresh and full of promise. I was in my backyard, enjoying the quiet hum of nature while pruning my rose bushes. The sun warmed my shoulders as I worked, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the space around me. It was peaceful, until the sound of heavy machinery shattered the calm. At first, I thought it might be roadwork or some construction happening nearby. But when I looked up, my heart sank. There she was, Karen from the Homeowners Association, HOA, standing at the edge of my property with her arms crossed and a smug look plastered across her face. Behind her loomed a bulldozer, its massive blade pointed directly at my fence, the same wrought iron fence that had stood there for over 100 years. "What are you doing?" I shouted, dropping my pruning shears and rushing toward her. My voice trembled with disbelief and anger. This couldn't be real. Karen didn't even blink. Enforcing code violations, she said coolly, like demolishing someone's property was just another routine task. "Your fence is non-compliant with HOA guidelines. It's too tall, too ornate, and frankly, it's an eyesore. An asterisk eyesore asterisk. That fence wasn't just metal bars, it was a piece of living history. My great-grandparents had built it back in 1902 when they constructed our home. Over the decades, ivy had grown through its intricate design, weaving memories into every twist and turn. To me, it wasn't just a fence, it was a symbol of everything our family had worked for. And now, thanks to Karen's obsession with uniformity, it was about to be destroyed. I ran forward, waving my arms wildly. "Stop! You can't do this." But no one listened. The driver ignored me completely, his machine rumbling closer. In seconds, the blade struck the fence, sending shards of iron clattering to the ground. Each crash felt like a punch to my chest. I wanted to scream, to cry, but I couldn't move. All I could do was watch as pieces of my heritage were torn apart. As the dust settled, I stood frozen, staring at the wreckage. My mind raced. How could this happen? Didn't Karen know how important this fence was? Then it hit me. She didn't. No one did, because I'd never told anyone the truth about my property. They thought it was just another suburban house. What they didn't realize, and what Karen definitely didn't know, was that my home wasn't ordinary. It was special. More than special, it was a historical landmark. The realization made my blood boil. Karen had bulldozed something priceless without a second thought. She thought she was enforcing rules, but she'd crossed a line she didn't even see coming. And now she was about to learn exactly who and what she was dealing with. Standing amidst the ruins, I clenched my fists. This wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was personal. The anger bubbling inside me didn't fade as I stormed back into the house. My hands were still shaking, and my mind raced with a mix of disbelief, frustration, and determination. Greg was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, when I burst in like a storm cloud ready to pour. He looked up, startled by the fire in my eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately sensing that something was off. "They tore it down," I said, pacing the room like a caged animal. "Karen and her crew came onto our property and bulldozed the fence, just destroyed it without warning." Greg blinked, clearly trying to process what I was saying. "Wait, they did asterisk what asterisk? Isn't that illegal? Don't they need some kind of permission?" "They think they have permission," I snapped, throwing my hands in the air. "They cited some ridiculous HOA rule about fences needing to match community aesthetics." I rolled my eyes so hard it almost hurt. Like anyone cares about matching aesthetics in a neighborhood where half the houses look like they were built last week. I stopped pacing for a moment and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself before I exploded. But then it hit me again, the full weight of what Karen had done. That fence wasn't just iron bars. It was part of my family's legacy. It had stood there for over a century, surviving storms, wars, and generations of change. And now, thanks to Karen's obsession with rules, it was gone. But then, As I stood there fuming, an idea began to form in my mind. A slow smile spread across my face, and Greg noticed it immediately. "What are you thinking?" he asked cautiously. "Our house," I said, turning to him with a glint in my eye. "It's not just any house, Greg. It's a historical landmark. Did you forget?" He frowned, confused. "Yeah, but what does that have to do with?" "That fence," I interrupted, pointing toward the backyard, even though we couldn't see it from where we were standing, "is part of the original structure. It's protected under state law because of the historical designation. Karen has no idea. She bulldozed a piece of protected history." Greg's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "As a heart attack," I replied, grabbing my laptop and pulling up the documents that proved our property status. There it was, clear as day. Our home, and everything original to it, was officially recognized as a historical landmark. The fence wasn't just a fence. It was a legally protected artifact. "This changes everything," I said, leaning forward, my voice tinged with excitement. "Karen thinks she's untouchable because she wears that HOA badge like it gives her power. But she just broke the law. Big time." Greg nodded slowly, catching on to my train of thought. "So what's the plan?" "We're going to make sure she knows exactly what she's dealing with," I said firmly. "First thing tomorrow, I'm marching into the HOA office with proof of the historical designation. Then we'll see how smug she feels when she realizes she messed with the wrong person." The more I thought about it, the more confident I became. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. Karen had crossed a line she didn't even know existed, and now she was going to learn that no one messes with history without consequences. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop picturing the look on Karen's face when I dropped the bombshell. For once, I felt like I had the upper hand. And trust me, I wasn't going to waste it. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual, my heart pounding with a mix of nerves and determination. This wasn't just another errand or complaint. It was a reckoning. I dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that screamed professionalism. A crisp blouse, tailored pants, and flats that clicked against the floor with every step. If I was going to face Karen, I needed to look like someone who meant business. Before leaving, I grabbed two things from the kitchen counter: a printed copy of my property's historical designation certificate and the business card of a lawyer Gray had recommended. Both felt heavy in my hand, but not because of their physical weight. It was the power they represented. Today, I wasn't just Claire, the quiet neighbor who liked gardening. Today, I was Claire, the woman who was about to turn Karen's world upside down. When I arrived at the HOA office, Karen was already seated behind her desk, looking every bit the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. Her pearl necklace gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and her hair was styled so perfectly it seemed immune to humidity. She glanced up as I entered, her lips curling into a polite but insincere smile. "Claire," she said sweetly, though her tone dripped with condescension. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. Instead, I walked straight to her desk and slapped the historical designation certificate down in front of her. The sound echoed through the small room, sharp and deliberate. "This says my property, including the fence you bulldozed, is protected under Section 4 of the State Historic Preservation Act," I said, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "Which means your little demolition project yesterday." "Yeah, that was a violation of state law." Karen's smile faltered for the first time. She picked up the document, scanning it quickly, her brow furrowing as she realized what it meant. For a moment, she looked genuinely shocked, like someone caught red-handed doing something they knew they shouldn't have done. But then, almost instantly, her expression shifted. She tried to mask her panic with indignation. I wasn't aware," she stammered, her voice wavering slightly. "You never mentioned anything about this before." "That's because no one asked," I shot back, leaning forward slightly to emphasize my point. "If you bothered to check, or even sent a letter instead of showing up with a bulldozer, You would have known. But you didn't care enough to find out, did you? Karen opened her mouth to respond, but I cut her off before she could speak. And while we're at it, I continued, placing the lawyer's business card on top of the certificate. Here's the contact info for my attorney. He'll be reaching out soon to discuss damages, legal fees, and whatever else comes to mind. Her eyes darted between the document and the business card, panic flickering across her face. Surely we can resolve this amicably, she said, her voice trembling now. No need to involve lawyers. Oh, I think there's plenty of need, I replied, standing tall and meeting her gaze head-on. You sent a bulldozer onto my land without permission, destroyed a century-old piece of history, and violated state law. Do you really think amicable is how this ends? For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The air in the room felt thick, charged with tension. Finally, Karen broke the silence, her voice softer now, almost pleading. There must be some way to fix this without escalating things. There is, I said firmly. Resign from the HOA board, issue a public apology, and pay for the restoration of the fence. Otherwise, I let the sentence hang unfinished, knowing full well the implications. Karen swallowed hard, her composure crumbling right before my eyes. As I turned to leave, I couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. This wasn't just about winning. It was about making sure Karen understood the consequences of her actions. And if she thought this was bad, she hadn't seen anything yet. Word traveled fast in Maplewood Lane. By noon, it seemed like everyone knew about my confrontation with Karen. Neighbors who rarely spoke to me suddenly stopped by to offer their support, or at least their curiosity. Some congratulated me for standing up to the HOA, while others whispered nervously about what might happen next. After all, Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She ruled this place with an iron fist, and crossing her wasn't exactly something people did lightly. But not everyone stayed silent. That evening, there was a soft knock on my door. When I opened it, I found Sarah standing there, clutching a manila folder tightly against her chest. Her hands trembled slightly, and her expression was tense but determined. "Claire," she said quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be watching. "I thought you should see this." She handed me the folder, and I stepped aside to let her in. Sitting down at the kitchen table, I opened it cautiously, unsure of what I'd find inside. What greeted me was shocking. Pages upon pages of emails, letters, and documents detailing shady dealings within the HOA. Contracts with inflated prices, payments made to companies owned by HOA members, and proposals so unethical they made my stomach churn. One email caught my attention immediately. It was from Karen herself, addressed to a contractor, discussing plans to sell off parts of the neighborhood's green space to developers. The subject line read, "Profit potential from undeveloped land." My jaw dropped as I read further. Not only were they planning to destroy one of the few remaining natural areas in the community, but they also intended to pocket kickbacks from the deal. "Where did you get these?" I asked, looking up at Sarah in disbelief. She sighed heavily, sinking into the chair across from me. "I've been collecting them for years," she admitted. "Ever since Karen fined me for planting native flowers in my yard. At first, I just wanted to protect myself, but then I started noticing patterns, things that didn't add up. So I kept digging." I stared at her, stunned by her bravery and her patience. "You're risking a lot by showing me this," I said finally. "If anyone finds out—" "I know," she interrupted, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "But if we don't fight back now, who will?" You stood up to her when no one else dared to. Maybe it's time we all did. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. For too long, Karen and her cronies had operated unchecked, using their power to bully residents and line their own pockets. And while I'd been focused on my own battle, Sarah had uncovered evidence that could take them all down. As I flipped through the documents again, a plan began to form in my mind. These weren't just papers, they were weapons. With this kind of proof, we could expose the corruption, hold the HOA accountable, and reclaim our neighborhood. But it wouldn't be easy. People would have to come forward, speak up, and risk everything. Sarah must have seen the determination in my eyes because she leaned closer, lowering her voice. "What are you thinking?" "We're calling a meeting," I said firmly. "Not just for us, but for everyone. It's time they saw Karen for who she really is." Sarah nodded slowly, a flicker of hope breaking through her cautious demeanor. "Then count me in," she said. "Whatever it takes." For the first time in days, I felt a spark of optimism. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was ours. And together, we were going to change everything. The day of the meeting arrived, and I could feel the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on me. This wasn't just another HOA gathering where Karen would drone on about mailbox colors or lawn maintenance. No, this was different, bigger. It was a reckoning, and every resident in Maplewood Lane had been summoned to attend. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as people filed in, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease. I stood near the podium at the front of the room, clutching the folder Sarah had given me. My heart raced, but I forced myself to breathe deeply. This was my moment to expose the truth, to show everyone the corruption that had festered under Karen's leadership. But as I scanned the crowd, I couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. Some neighbors whispered anxiously to each other. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Karen sat stiffly in the front row, her arms crossed and her lips pressed into a thin line. She looked calm on the surface, but I caught the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes when she glanced at me. When it was finally my turn to speak, I stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent, all eyes on me. For a brief second, I hesitated, the enormity of the moment hitting me like a wave. Then I reminded myself why I was here, not just for revenge, but for justice. "Many of you know what happened to my fence," I began, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "Karen and her crew tore it down without warning, claiming it violated HOA guidelines. What she didn't know, and what none of us realized until now, is that my property is a registered historical landmark. That fence wasn't just metal bars. It was part of our shared history, protected by state law." Gasps rippled through the crowd. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at Karen, who sat frozen like a statue. I held up the folder Sarah had given me. But that's not all. These documents reveal a pattern of corruption within the HOA leadership. Illegal contracts, undisclosed profits, and plans to sell off parts of our green space for personal gain. I pulled out one of the emails and held it up for everyone to see. This email, from Karen herself, proposes selling undeveloped land to developers in exchange for kickbacks. Does anyone here think that's acceptable? The room erupted into murmurs. Some people looked outraged. Others seemed stunned. Karen bolted to her feet, her face flushed with anger. "That's slander," she shouted, pointing a finger at me. "You have no right to accuse me of such things. The law says otherwise," I shot back, my voice rising above the noise. "And unless you resign immediately, I'll make sure everyone hears about this, from the local news to the State Preservation Board." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. It was Sarah, sitting near the back, her hands moving steadily together. One by one, others joined in, the applause growing louder and more resolute until the entire room was filled with sound. Karen's face turned pale, her confident facade crumbling before our eyes. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Instead, she sank back into her chair, defeated. As I stepped away from the podium, I felt a surge of relief and pride. This wasn't just my victory. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt powerless against the HOA's tyranny. Together, we had taken the first step toward reclaiming our neighborhood and holding those in power accountable. In the weeks that followed, Maplewood Lane underwent a transformation, not just in its leadership but in its spirit. Karen resigned from the HOA board almost immediately after the meeting, her reputation shattered beyond repair. The other members of the board soon followed suit, leaving the organization in disarray. It was clear to everyone that a fresh start was needed, and for the first time in years, residents came together to make it happen. A new board was elected, made up of neighbors who genuinely cared about the community. They weren't perfect. No one is, but they were transparent, approachable, and committed to preserving what made Maplewood Lane special. One of their first acts was to allocate funds from the city's historical society to restore my fence. Skilled artisans worked tirelessly to piece it back together, carefully matching the original design down to the smallest detail. When it was finally completed, it stood as a testament not only to my family's history, but also to the resilience of our neighborhood. Standing in my backyard one evening, I couldn't help but smile as I ran my fingers along the cool iron bars. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting golden light over the yard and highlighting the intricate patterns of the fence. Greg joined me, handing me a glass of wine. "Feels good, doesn't it?" he said, raising his glass slightly. "More than good," I replied, clinking mine against his. "It feels like closure." But this wasn't just about me or my fence. Something bigger had shifted in Maplewood Lane. Neighbors who once avoided each other now greeted one another warmly. People started organizing block parties, planting gardens, and even working together to clean up the park at the end of the street. There was a renewed sense of pride in our community, a shared understanding that we were stronger when we stood together. Sarah became one of my closest friends during this time. We often sat on my porch, sipping coffee and talking about how far we'd come. "I never thought I'd see the day when people actually cared about this place," she confessed one afternoon. "For so long, it felt like no one noticed, or worse, didn't care." "Well, they do now," I said, glancing around at the lively scene outside. Kids played tag in the cul-de-sac, while parents laughed nearby. Someone had strung fairy lights between two trees, giving the whole area a magical glow as twilight settled in. Greg leaned back in his chair, watching the chaos with amusement. "You know, if someone told me a year ago that we'd be here right now, fighting corruption, restoring fences, and hosting neighborhood potlucks, I wouldn't have believed them." "Neither would I admitted, smiling softly. "But look at us now." The truth was, none of this would have been possible without courage. The kind of courage it takes to stand up for what's right, even when you're scared. And while I knew challenges still lay ahead, I also knew we could face them together. As night fell and the stars began to twinkle above, I felt a deep sense of peace. Maplewood Lane wasn't perfect. It never had been, but it was ours. And that made all the difference. Looking back on everything that happened, I realize now that this fight was never just about a fence, or even about Karen. It was about so much more. It was about standing up for what matters, not just for myself, but for everyone who believed in the beauty of imperfection, the value of history, and the power of community. Maplewood Lane had always been special to me, but until recently, I hadn't fully appreciated why. What makes a neighborhood truly great isn't its manicured lawns or matching mailboxes. It's the people, their quirks, their passions, their willingness to come together when it counts. Before all of this, we were divided. Neighbors living side by side, but rarely connecting, too afraid to rock the boat or challenge authority. But when Karen crossed the line, she unintentionally united us. We discovered strength in our shared anger, hope in our collective determination, and joy in reclaiming what was ours. Now, as I walk through the streets of Maplewood Lane, I see a place transformed, not because it looks different, but because it feels different. The houses are still painted in soft pastels, the trees still sway gently in the breeze, and the sidewalks remain cracked in places from years of wear. But there's a new energy here, an authenticity that wasn't present before. People wave hello without hesitation, kids ride bikes freely down the cul-de-sacs, and laughter echoes through the air more often than arguments. Sarah and I have become regular fixtures at neighborhood events, organizing seasonal festivals, and planting native flowers in the park. Greg jokes that I've turned into a community activist, but deep down, I think he's proud of how far I've come. So am I. Standing up to Karen taught me something important. My voice matters. And so does yours. When we speak up, when we refuse to stay silent, we can create change. Of course, life isn't perfect. There will always be disagreements, challenges, and moments of doubt. But what sets us apart now is how we handle them. Instead of turning against each other, we talk things out. Instead of letting fear dictate our actions, we take risks for the betterment of everyone. That's what makes Maplewood Lane feel like home again. One evening, as Greg and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, he turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we'll ever forget all of this?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward the neighborhood. I shook my head. No, and I don't think we should. These scars remind us of where we've been and how far we've come. He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. You know, sometimes I wonder if Karen regrets any of it. I thought about that for a moment. Truthfully, I didn't care whether she regretted her actions or not. What mattered was that she'd forced us to confront the cracks in our foundation, and in doing so, gave us the chance to rebuild something stronger. As the sky turned shades of pink and orange, I leaned back in my chair, feeling grateful for everything we'd accomplished. Sure, the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but as long as we continued to stand together, no bulldozer or bully would ever tear us apart. Maplewood Lane wasn't perfect anymore, and honestly, I preferred it that way. Its charm lay in its quirks, its strength in its diversity, and its resilience in its people. And while the future was uncertain, one thing was clear: this wasn't just a neighborhood. It was a family.